clicker. Thank you. Very quick question for the audience with a show of hands. Do you know a brand called Horlicks? Horlicks, okay, fine. So I'm kind of fascinated by Horlicks. And I'm fascinated for this reason, that if I were to drink a cup of Horlicks in Hyderabad, something very different would happen to me than if I were to drink a cup of Horlicks in, say, Hackney. Okay, so if I'm in India, this is what would happen. Essentially, I would know how to skateboard, I could do wheelies on my BMX, I could go upside down. Essentially, I would be full of energy and ready to face the challenges of the day. I would be taller, smarter, and more energetic than anybody else. In fact, it is India's #1 energy drink. If I was anywhere close to, I don't know, London Fields, and I would be drinking a cup of Horlicks, I'm probably in my pajamas or in bed, because it puts you to sleep. And I find that kind of magic and scary and exciting and fascinating, because at its essence, or not even at its essence, it's the same product. The product in the box is exactly the same. It's the powder, it's the malted, milky powder. And you start to go, how is it physically, psychologically, how is it physically possible that the same product can cause two different reactions? Because they have to do it. GSK wouldn't be allowed to say that if it didn't have that effect. That would be lying, and we cannot do that. It's not allowed. So what's going on? And where I've come to believe, really, is this idea that actually expectations can change experiences. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. And I started my fascination, I guess, with brands in Sainsbury's. And it was a very particular Sainsbury's. It's a Sainsbury's on Sydney Sussex Street in Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate. And at the time, there were two supermarkets in Cambridge. There was a Sainsbury's and a Marks and Spencer's. And as poor students, nobody ever went to the Marks and Spencer's, ever. So I spent a very long time waiting in queues. And I don't even think debit cards were invented, and certainly mobile phones weren't around. So you had to find something else to do while you waited. And I used to play a game that I called basket genetics. And basket genetics is essentially looking at the basket of the people in front of you without looking at their faces. And you try and build up a pen portrait. So I don't know how old they are, where did they last go to on holiday, what's the last film they saw, what was a great Saturday night. And whether I was right or wrong in those sort of heuristic shortcuts that I was taking, the fact that actually I was able to create really deep, rich portraits of those people was something that sort of really triggered a fascination, and I've been really lucky to have spent my career sort of immersed in this world. And I got interested in brands because if you think back to, I guess, the original definition of brands, it's a brand on cattle, so branding, it was about ownership. I own this cow belongs to me. And then you think about the 19th century, and let's think about some of the famous brands like Coleman's Mustard or Kellogg's. And essentially, a brand became a mark of authenticity. As mass consumption proliferated, people needed to be sure what was in the box wasn't counterfeit. So again, go back to Coleman's or Kellogg's. A lot of times, the logo was the name, and it was the signature because it was true. And actually, where we are now is what brands are is about identity, and it's about self. And that's one of the many things I love about brands, which is that mixture of sort of rational and emotional. And I guess you could almost call it sort of ambidextrous, the sort of logic and magic. And I do find it really fascinating. I remember reading a quote which talked about human beings as feeling creatures who think, not thinking creatures who feel. And actually, we feel first, and we give rational reasons. When somebody asks us about a product, we may well give a rational reason, but actually the truth is very different. I love this picture. Harley Davidson. So the CEO of Harley actually said at a conference once, we don't sell motorbikes. What we sell is the ability for a 43-year-old accountant to dress in black leather, ride through small towns, and have people be afraid of him. And when I was looking, I was sort of Googling, and I'm absolutely convinced he lives in Tunbridge Wells, and I think his name is Eric. But anyway, he has that ability. But he would never tell you that. He would probably talk about the horsepower and the ratio and all those other things. But it's not. It's that emotion as well. And brands do interesting things to the brain, and we've known that, I guess, since the era of Don Draper. And there's a classic episode, if you're a Draper Mad Men fan, where Don romances Dr. Faye Miller. So I've obviously spent too long watching Mad Men. But anyway, Faye Miller is one of these early researchers trying to understand the psychology and what's going on with brands. And in the 60s, there were the classic experiments where blind tasting, people preferred the taste of Pepsi. They took the blindfolds off, showed them the brands, and everybody said, oh, no, I hate that one, I like Coke. So they knew back then that brands did something interesting to the brain. And they also did all sorts of wonderful things where they did tests with, it's actually slices of turkey. They did it with potato chips. They also did a great one with beer, where they got sort of seasoned beer drinkers with a stated preference for one particular brand. They took the beer out of the bottles, put it into glasses, and nobody could tell which was their brand. They then took them to another room, gave them the same beers but in branded glasses, and everybody eulogized and talked at length about the flavor and the hoppiness, but they couldn't tell without the brand. And I find, again, I find that fascinating. Another one I love is the ice cream experiment. This was slightly more recently. 2 bowls of ice cream, exactly the same ice cream. One was labeled full fat, one was labeled low fat. No prizes for which was more popular. But actually, when you looked at the verbatims that people talked about, the types of words they used with the full fat was creamy, luxurious, rich, smooth, satisfying, you know, ooh. And the low-fat one was a bit sandy, and people would talk about that sandy and soapy and how it felt in their mouth, and they really didn't like it, and it was exactly the same product. And you start to say, you know, well, if I ask the question, how does it taste? One tasted bad and one tasted good, but they're exactly the same. It was the brand around it. And then you go back to expectations changing experience. And taste is really fascinating because actually it's more, taste isn't logical. I think there was something that was released last week, a team at Oxford University are looking into why wine tastes better on holiday, and then you buy it and you bring it home and it just doesn't taste as good. And, you know, it's because it's not sunny and it's rainy, but you know, it isn't just, taste isn't rational. What becomes interesting, so it sort of fits a little bit with previous talk about behavioral economics, is this world of sort of neuroscience and what neuroscience and neuromarketing is opening up to us. So this is the human brain. Recently, a team from Bayer Medical School in Dallas have repeated those classic cola examples, but they hooked people up to non-invasive MRI, essentially to brain scans. Because what they wanted to try and do was to see not what people said was going on, but essentially which bits of the brain were lighting up, because we understand the bits of the brain and how they connect and sort of what they mean. So what was interesting was exactly the same results. Everybody preferred the taste of Pepsi. It delivers from a sort of chemical, it delivers a quick sugar rush, a hit, very, very quickly in a way that Coke doesn't. And as a sort of side, when they tried to reinvent new Coke, they tried to put that sort of rush in, and it just didn't work. But so it's the bit of the brain called the putamen, which is almost like the reward center, which is about evaluation of tastes and flavors. Everybody, that lit up. Pepsi, logically, is preferred. And then they did the thing where they took away they took the sort of blindfolds off and they could see the brands. And the bit that went absolutely crazy was a bit of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is all associated with identity and self-sense. So it's that moment when you go, God, I just get it. And you sort of have that gut feeling. It's actually the prefrontal cortex just behind your forehead. And what was interesting is that there wasn't much of that with Pepsi. With Coke, it went absolutely ballistic. And you start to go, actually, the emotional cultural relevance and the recall was so strong that it actually overrode the fact that actually people logically or sort of neurologically preferred the taste of Pepsi. And again, I just find that, you know, I find that absolutely bizarre and fascinating. Again, you know, the power of the brand, the magic of brands. They did a wonderful example with wine, where they took expensive bottles and cheap bottles of wine, and they swapped the wine around. And again, respondents were hooked up to an MRI scanner, and what they found was that actually far more dopamine, which is essentially, it's sort of almost like a pleasure hormone, it was a more pleasurable experience to drink what people thought was the expensive wine. Expensive wine tasted better, and it wasn't just the perception, it actually did, it was a more pleasurable experience. So then I tried to think, well, this is all just taste, and taste is subjective, and I sort of said that myself. What about in the world of medicine? Because actually medicine isn't subjective. Medicine is medicine is medicine. And there's a wonderful study, actually it was published in 1981 in the British Medical Journal, And it was a team, I think the report was called, it was looking into the branding properties on analgesics, so on pain relief. And what this team of researchers did is they took two exact pills, pain relief pills, and they put one into a branded box. It was a branded, a well-known pain relief brand, the other into a white plain box. And what was fascinating about the results was that the branded painkillers reduced pain by 30% more than the unbranded ones. So nothing changed apart from the packaging around it, but scientifically, medically, and the results have never been challenged. It's been cited across the world. Branding makes products work harder. And that, I think, is fascinating. The expectation of the brand not only changes the perception, but changes the physical performance. And I think that's kind of magic. So I'm going to issue you a bit of a challenge. I call it the challenge of the baby carrots, and I'll explain why. Given that hopefully I will have persuaded you that actually the impact of brands can change the experience of a product, you could do that to sell more things. And you can do that to try and think about good. And actually, you can try and harness that for a power of good. So this is my baby carrot challenge. An agency in the States called Crispin Porter Bogowski didn't take my challenge, but took a brief from a carrot manufacturer. And this is what they did. They marketed them as junk food. So they created, they look like sort of cheesy What's-Its or Doritos. They look unhealthy, disgusting, chemically ridden. You know, it's just, I think it's brilliant, actually. So they created whole brands around it. They created vending machines, eat them like junk food. And what I love about it is that not only sales rose by 12%, and as a marketeer, that's what their job was, but actually, again, when you look at the verbatims, people were coming back and they were saying, I take a bag of them, and I take them like potato chips or popcorn, and I sit in front of the TV and I snack on them. Or I grab a handful of them, and I go into the car and I drive. And people were talking about the sweetness and the crunchiness, and they were talking about it like it was a junk food, because it had been branded as that. And that, to me, is magic. That's my challenge of baby carrots, because I think baby carrots are just the beginning, and that's the magic of brands. Thank you.